when Ian Collins came across to brief us, and I knew Ian previously from my time in Melbourne, he said, your side will have to prove itself, he said, and don't be dismayed, he said, because your list has been designed to win one or no games.
Deep inside each footy club is the story of how it came to be. Team Builders goes behind the scenes with those who made it all happen, to give insight into the creation of some of Australia's biggest football franchises. With Tasmania in the early stages of building a standalone club, after finally being granted a licence to enter the AFL in 2028, the first new club to enter the national competition in 16 years, Team Builders will look back on all the startup teams that joined the then VFL as it expanded beyond the confines of Victoria. From South Melbourne's move to Sydney in 1982, to the Eagles and Bears in 1987, through to Gold Coast and GWS in 2011 and 2012 respectively, we'll talk to inaugural CEOs, presidents, coaches, and star players to get an inside look into how these AFL teams were built from scratch. This is AFL Team Builders.
Welcome to AFL Team Builders. In this episode, we explore the second VFL AFL team to be born out of Western Australia, the Fremantle Dockers. Emerging in a splash of purple, red, green and white from an area steeped in football history, the Dockers entered the league in 1995 after the AFL granted them a provisional licence in December 1993. While their crosstown rivals, the Eagles, were only given 6 months to build their club in 1987, Fremantle had a slightly longer runway, almost 18 months. That was about their only advantage over a West Coast team whose powerful shadow stretched menacingly across most of the state and indeed the AFL. But little brother was determined to shake things up. In fact, inaugural CEO David Hatt recalls the AFL imploring Freo to build a club that pushed the boundaries of what had come before them.
We didn't offend the AFL, but we came up, they said to us that they'd like us to do something different in terms of the way we presented ourselves. And so we tried to portray ourselves as a family club with its basis, with its roots in Fremantle, which is, one of the home, if you like, of football in our state. That was rewarding. They were loyal to us, even though they weren't great in number. But we did things that were different. Like we had green, purple, and red, as well as white. Sorry. The red and the green were meant to illustrate the signalling flags of dockers who were guiding their ships into the harbour. They were also conveniently red, white and green were the colours of Italy, and we had a whole bunch of Italian supporters who were very enthusiastic about those sort of things. But we had purple as well, and no one else had purple, and so the original reaction from the AFL was less than wonderful. I remember Ross Oakley saying, well, you can't market green and purple. We want you to come up with something different. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but green and purple are exactly the sort of things we want because they're different. And there's this tennis club in the UK called Wimbledon, and they've been marketing purple and green pretty well. So I think we got most of our marketing initiatives pretty well under control. That purple is now symbolic of Fremantle, and it's really, they've changed the appearance and so on, but our basic colours still remain the same.
Ross Kelly, the inaugural Fremantle chairman, also recalls some vivid discussions as the club sought to settle on its nickname, even receiving some unusual advice from a friendly stranger with a military intelligence background.
16 clubs of them, I think 12 of them was either a bird or a animal, or, a tiger or a what have you. And I thought that it would be good if we could get a name that was different from an animal and which satisfied or personified the people of Fremantle, because Fremantle is about its people, and there are a lot of characters down there of all shapes and sizes. So that was, as a starting point, we conducted a competition. The West Australian newspaper conducted a competition, and we got the usual names, that the sailors and the mariners and the dolphins, but I thought they weren't appropriate. The Lumpers isn't a good name. The jailers, I used to sometimes tease my Fremantle friends and say we might call them that. But eventually the consultant and the board came up with the name Dockers, largely because it was associated with the work that we did. Of course, that in itself had some problems because at that stage the Painters and Dockers Union, particularly the one in Melbourne, was notorious for its misconduct and was on the front page of the papers all the time. So the board had to do a bit of persuading to be allowed to even call it the Dockers, though people were thinking we were associated with a criminal union. But we got through. And the other interesting thing about that was that when we'd picked the name for the Dockers, and I had to go across to Melbourne to give it to the VFL Commission and get their approval, I was coming back on the plane and a fellow sat next to me, and it turned out he was from Army Intelligence. He said to me, what had I been doing? And I said I was associated with a new club. It turned out he was from East Fremantle, and he was an East Fremantle supporter. And he didn't ask me the name. He said, when are you going to announce it? And I said, we're going to try and keep it secret for about 9 weeks when we have the launch. And he looked at me and he said, you'll never do it. He said, even stuff that appears in the Pentagon is known within weeks in the Kremlin. He said, but he said the way we keep things secret, really secret, is that we put out a lot of false information. So even if the right information gets out, they don't know whether it's right. And so we deliberately started a campaign with the assistance of the AFL, or the VFL as it was then, and we floated all sorts of names. And so it turned out that about a fortnight before, someone rang up one of the Melbourne radio stations and says, the new team's name is the Dockers. And the bloke says, yes, I've heard that. And I've heard another 950 other names as well this week, and just discounted it. So effectively, we did manage to keep the name secret. We might have gone for a 2-colour jumper and been as traditional as we could. That incidentally wasn't our own initial suggestion. The AFL said they wanted 3 or 4 colours in our jumper. They wanted something different. We recruited Neil Turner, who was the designer of the boxing kangaroo flag for the America's Cup Challenge, and he designed our jumper. We went through hundreds of iterations of the jumper, and it came out something looking like Peel Thunder or Port Adelaide's jumper, a teal colour, a black, and a something or other. And we eventually got to the old Dockers home jumper, but with blue in it. The jumper looked okay, but it wasn't startling. And then, of course, Neil said, I know what to do with it, but you won't be game. And he showed us the jumper with purple. Well, we loved it. The trouble was that it was a bit radical for some of the West Australian Football Commission, and we had a job of work to do to be allowed to keep purple. But I think that in itself was also an attempt to do something that was defining.
So, amongst a cloud of intrigue and secrecy, the Purple Haze had quickly sprung to life. Suddenly Perth was a 2-team town. A town, however, that was dominated by the incumbent. Those in charge of building the Dockers knew that they were up against it in many respects.
During our study, we did an opinion survey which projected that West Coast would, of the football audience, if you like, which is a bit hard to define, that West Coast would retain about 64% of support. Ironically enough, a third of their squad had come from the 2 Fremantle teams, East and South Fremantle. You know, their best players like Matera and Sumic and Worsfold and so on. They were all South Fremantle players, for example, who'd been and taken part in 2 premierships. So, you know, we were competing with the biggest act in town. They'd overcome a difficult start, had won 2 premierships, and the hearts and minds of people were divided, but even Fremantle people, because of the large number of East Fremantle and South Fremantle players in their squad who they'd followed through their waffle competition. West Coast had a stranglehold, if you like, on the commercial sector. All of a sudden they were very, very popular. They had a good membership and obviously growing because of their success. You know, and success has many fathers, as you would be aware of, and we were an unknown quantity. And there was also a general view in the WA Football League that one more AFL team would spell the end of their competition as they knew it. And there was some truth in that, but they've managed now to fashion their competition to accommodate two AFL teams with comfort. There's now even people talking of a third, but that's sort of down the track. But yeah, I mean, again, we were angry. We were angry with the AFL because they, through the West Australian member of the AFL Commission, anxious for us to be not taking away any strength, if you like, from West Coast, because they were the goose that was laying the golden egg at the time. And so if you wanted to sell a viewing box or signage or whatever at the ground, which obviously we did, we were forced to charge the same amount as West Coast were charging, and they were charging more than anyone else in the AFL. And so the commercial side was really hard. I mean, people think that football clubs make their money principally through large memberships. Well, that's only part of the story, because it really comes from having high-level coterie groups on match days, business people who would provide substantial sponsorship and so on. So whilst we valued our members, we also had to service our members. And so the net cost to us was nowhere near what West Coast were dragging in, if you like, on the commercial side of things. And we simply couldn't compete with them. So I can remember there were 200 private boxes at Subiaco Oval. Our best effort was selling 130. They had a waiting list of 70, usually, for the 200 boxes, and that generates huge revenue. So that's another. I'm sorry to be negative again, but that's another difficulty that we faced. But gradually, we improved.
Inaugural coach Gerard Neesham was, in many ways, a maverick, and in keeping with the new club's ethos, did things his own way. A 5-time West Australian Football League, or WAFL, premiership player and 4-time premiership coach, Neesham was a true football visionary who many believe was ahead of his time. His possession-based game plan, nicknamed Chip and Carry, was developed through Neesham's observations of water polo and field hockey tactics. Successfully ingrained over many years in his Claremont players in the WAFL, Neesham's task was to try and implement it at AFL level in a very short time frame.
There was a lot of commentary, I suppose, on the stuff that I was doing at the second tier, which was pretty new. And so that may have appealed, but we'd also had a really good, winning record. I was seriously excited about the prospect, which would suggest that I was probably pretty naive. Like if I wanted to stay coaching for a long period of time, you'd never be the first coach of a startup, because that nearly puts an end to your career. But just the idea of being the first coach of the Fremantle Football Club, and it would take me too long to explain my full sporting history that's all been born out of Fremantle. So all my uncles were, a lot of them were famous jockeys who won Perth Cups, and cousins who won Melbourne Cups and all this sort of stuff. But we were all Fremantle people. So we all schooled in Fremantle, we were born in Fremantle, and so the idea of being the first, the inaugural coach of the Fremantle Football Club, far outweighed the issue of whether it was a good career move, or whether it was something that I was overawed by. I felt that we were capable of playing at that level if I could assemble a good enough team.
With Neesham secured, Fremantle turned its attention to players. Instead of the bounty of early draft picks and financial assistance granted to most expansion teams in modern times, the Dockers were given minimal concessions. Many who were involved with the club in 1994 are still disappointed, even outright angry, at the lack of help from the AFL 3 decades later. The result was an inaugural squad that included a couple of big-name WA recruits, such as Hawthorn Best and Fairest and Premiership winner Ben Allen, and Kangaroos defender Peter Mann, in addition to some seasoned journeymen and a host of young hopefuls. It was the list build which also cost them access to future champions such as Essendon duo Matthew Lloyd and Scott Lucas, as well as St Kilda champion Robert Harvey, among others, as Kelly recalls.
When Ian Collins came across to brief us, and I knew Ian previously from my time in Melbourne, he said, your side will have to prove itself, he said, and don't be dismayed, he said, because your list has been designed to win one or no games. I was quite surprised by that, but that was how it was, and so the rules were made quite difficult. I'll give you an example. We were given the opportunity to select not from all the waffle clubs in Perth, but only from 4 of them, half of them. We could have players from. The others, we were restricted in the number we could recruit from them. I think we were allowed to recruit up to 15 uncontracted players from the existing clubs, with the proviso that if we took a player from one of those clubs, they got a 16-year-old pre-draft choice in compensation. So if you took, we got Todd Ridley and Tony Delaney, both serviceable players from Essendon, and they recruited before the draft Matthew Lloyd and Lucas, both champions. And so effectively, when we had our first choice, we were allowed a first draft pick the next year in 1996. And what happened then was that we picked Clive Waterhouse, who effectively was number 15 in the draft because 14 other low draft choices had been plucked off before they even entered it.
Hatt too still vividly remembers the difficulties of building that inaugural squad, with the club unable to afford several high-profile recruits who were interested in joining the startup team.
There's another good instance that illustrated the difficulties. We were very keen on recruiting Stuart Lowe, the centre-half forward from St Kilda, who was a very prominent player, and we needed 2 key forwards. He was one of them. But we also were very keen on Robert Harvey, and we wanted to recruit Lowe and Harvey, who were more than available to what money we had, and also they wanted to change. And the problem was that we couldn't advance them the sort of deal because that we wanted to, because the Football Commission stopped us from spending even up to our salary cap, never mind above it, because they watched very carefully what we were doing. That would have changed the history of Fremantle considerably, because they were 2 champion players. If we got those 2, we might even get Nicky Winmar to come home, and then whilst that wouldn't have helped St Kilda much, it would have helped us enormously. So that was another area in which we had some serious difficulty. We didn't get as far as we should have done with them. We just had a warning, if you like, from the Football Commission that, we had to be very careful of our salary cap, etc. But Lowe and Harvey were more than interested. We actually flew Lowe over here. He was very happy. He was very pleased. What we didn't know initially was that if we got Lowe, we'd get Harvey. He was well into his career by then. They both were, but they were both champions and exactly what we needed. Our players also were not hardened as you need to be after a couple of seasons, and we had to recruit young kids from Western Australia because of the difficulties that were imposed. So we got a couple of South Australians and some other Victorian people from time to time, but not enough to get us into the next level. And we also made some unwise choices in the draft, like most clubs, except ours were glaringly exposed, and I can still hear Fremantle people saying, "Why did you pick this kid in 1998 instead of that one in 1997 or whatever?" So, but our drafting was, again, we didn't have experienced recruiters, and we didn't have the same level of intelligence, if you like, that would come through being a Victorian club where you got 10 lots of people looking for a bunch of players, seeing them on a regular basis. So, yeah, we made some of those sorts of organisational, if you like, or philosophical errors.
Neesham knew he was up against it when it came to building a competitive squad, with strict signing rules and minimal recruiting know-how at the club ahead of its debut season. Although some sneaky advice from friend Kevin Sheedy gave him the imprimatur to do whatever it took to get in the ear of a potential recruit.
It wasn't obvious to people who the best players were. If you look at all the draft that went on by all the clubs, there was a big hit and miss ratio. There was a lot of people who were drafted at 50 and played 300 games, and guys who were plastered at 5 and played 3 games. So there was no exact science at that point because there was no resource to be out looking at players, assessing them, doing all that sort of stuff. We had no staff come on really until the end of that 94 season. So we didn't have anyone come into the drafting space or the recruitment space until October. And so that made life extraordinarily difficult. We were not allowed to talk to any potential players in season. So that meant you had to wait to post-season to talk to them. I must say, I was at that stage a good friend of Kevin Sheedy's because I promoted a couple of my players to Sheeds through a good friend of mine, Tony Bahadja, and Sheeds took a few fellas out of the waffle and my recommendation. So we become friends through that experience. It was just a football thing. And his advice to me was don't wait for anyone to tell you when you can start talking to them. Talk to them straight away. So that was typical Sheeds. And then the other thing he said, we've lost for the first time ever a premiership out of the state, which was the West Coast Eagles in 92. And so he said, I don't think you'll get any players. He said, I think what you'll do is elevate their price. So, of course, at the end of 94, the West Coast won their second one. So that made it like mission impossible to extract anyone out of there. And we spoke to a lot of players, over the course of time, trying to convince them to come over the West. We bought a lot of surfboards. We took a fair whack of fellas to Rottnest. We wined and dined them. And, there was Sholly from North Melbourne, Robbie Harvey, Tingay, McCurry, Darrell White. We spoke to Paul Roos. There was a real range of terrific players. They were all wonderful players, established players who could play at that level, and we just didn't get any of them. So that made life really, really difficult because if none of those guys would come, and if none of your first choice players would come, we were going to really struggle to get anyone out of Victoria. And so then we had assembled our group. We grabbed a whole bunch of young fellas, which in the main we didn't know who they were. Our recruitment staff didn't start virtually till after the draft in the first year. So you had very little chance of picking, good players. Having said all that, that was just the reality of the world. And we weren't whinging and moaning. We were happy to be in the game. We wanted to play. We assembled a group of people who were really up for the game.
Next came pre-season training in the stinging Perth heat. Tough enough to endure for any footballer, but one made even the more difficult and complex due to a lack of facilities, as Hatt remembers.
We were based, in a sense, at Fremantle Oval, which was a logical move, but we had to share it with one of the waffle clubs, South Fremantle, who didn't like us much because they thought that South Fremantle ought to have encompassed the new AFL team. And so they had some training facilities or rooms or whatever, change rooms and so on, which had been built, I think, at the turn of the century. And the ones that we got had been built earlier. So it was very, very difficult. You couldn't actually fit the whole squad into a change room at the one time. Meeting rooms were usually held in a restaurant in Fremantle, and we had to obviously share the Oval with South Fremantle for training, and we got the time slots that they didn't want. So none of it was ideal, and I know other clubs that had difficulties, like West Coast had some initial difficulties in that regard, but the training facility was less than wonderful. What it did have was the fact that it was in the middle of Fremantle's city, if you like, and so we were a well-regarded fixture by most of the populace of Fremantle, and so the players were always made to feel welcome, even if it was in third-rate facilities. We see today with, say, Greater Western Sydney, or even Gold Coast or Brisbane when they started, they had, I think, access to more cooperation and more money from the AFL than we had. Matter of fact, I'm sure they did. But the AFL was going through some various stages of economic responsibility, like Fitzroy were disappearing fast because they couldn't, in inverted commas, manage themselves, and they were struggling for all sorts of good reasons, historical and otherwise. Nowadays, of course, it's different. The AFL can throw around all sorts of money especially in the new franchises.
For Neesham, training at makeshift venues brought with it challenges that most coaches didn't have to encounter, and it also made teaching his team a new, never-before-seen game plan even more difficult.
Contract on the property it was their oval, and so they had a motocross event over the summer on the oval, and so that meant you couldn't use the thing for about 10 weeks. So we were stuck out in parks and different places, but that's just pioneering. That's what that's what comes with the patch. We changed out of the visitors' change rooms at Fremantle Oval, which I'd changed out of a lot of times as an opposing player. When I played for Fremantle, Swan Districts and Claremont, I changed out of these change rooms. They were pretty rough. The South Fremantle boys didn't put a lot of effort into making them a pleasant experience, which was a lot like being at Victoria Park. You didn't really want to leave your bag or even get undressed in the conditions at that place. But that's the fun of being in sport. All of those things are fabulous. And so, yeah, we didn't get an established place to train at really until this in-season. Most of your best work's done pre-season. In-season's just keeping them up. Pre-season's when you get them to where they're going to be, and that'll give you a chance. So our first pre-season was pretty ordinary. Second pre-season was way better. We shifted a lot of it to Aquinas. It was good, but the guys embraced it. I think, we did something very unique. It was frowned upon by people who didn't know it. Then we had to, find trainers and other things. So it was all post the '94 season. So you had October to February to find everyone, bed them into Perth, West Australia, with no staff initially, pick a squad, get them on the park, train them, try and get them to understand what we're doing. One of the places we trained regularly, we had to emu stalk it for glass. This is where the drinkers had a few drinks and quite often would break a bottle.
An arduous summer on the track behind them, the AFL's newest club flew to Melbourne for their debut contest on April Fool's Day 1995. With only 12 players boasting AFL experience, none of whom had managed 100 games, with Ben Allen the most experienced on 98 games, the Dockers competed hard and tried to capitalise on their unique game plan. The AFL's newest team was facing a stinging defeat when they found themselves down by 30 points early in the fourth quarter. However, they stormed back in the last stanza to fall agonisingly short by just 5 points, an impressive first outing.
There's the siren. Richmond have won it in a thriller. And Gerard Neesham ponders what might have been.
The performance was encouraging, with the fast-paced, counter-attacking game style catching many teams off guard. But rivals soon started to work the Dockers out, and as winter hit and the injuries piled up, Fremantle nosedived from a respectable 5-5 start to lose their next 7 games on the trot before finishing 13th out of 15 clubs. Hatt recalls a sense of pride and satisfaction once the first season on the national stage wrapped up.
One of the largest reasons we improved was that Gerard Neesham managed to conjure up a way of playing football that hadn't been seen too often before. And so we played attractive football, dangerous football, some people used to say, because when it came unstuck, our style of playing certainly did come unstuck. But when it was running well, we were fine. I mean, after 10 games, we were, I think, 5-5. We'd beaten Hawthorn, who were a big club, obviously, in Melbourne, and we were actually in the 8. And people had predicted that we would not win a match, but we were brittle, we were under-resourced and we were under-trained at that stage. So the kids got pretty tired towards June and July, and it was interesting. Neil Danaher, who was an assistant coach and what a great man he is, said to us, it's very nice that we've won 5 games out of the first 10. Wait until it gets wet in July and August and then come back and tell us that you're doing well. And he was right. But yeah, look, it was on a variety of fronts. We were still facing difficulties, but doing better than people gave us hope for it. So we did have some success, but was never going to be enduring success because people work you out. And clubs that had good coaches who knew after half a season exactly what they were going to meet when they met Fremantle. They knew what to do, or at least part of what to do to counter that. But it was very encouraging. The crowds really liked us. We didn't have huge crowds, which we needed, but we didn't have huge crowds. But on balance, I suppose at the end of the first season, we had made a trading plus or a trading success. We'd also done much better on the field, and our prospects were not much better than when we started, because the recruiting process that we had to endure when we started was put in place for the first 3 years. So we couldn't see our way of getting into the players that we needed to get into. But I think with what we got, we did okay, and Gerard certainly did very well.
Neesham, always the left field thinker, sees things slightly differently. If anything, he says, the Dockers probably won too many games in their first season. However, looking back 3 decades later, he has immense pride at some of the ground broken by the young Dockers, especially of the tactics that he introduced and his determination to champion the cause of Aboriginal players in his squad.
It wasn't a deliberate thing, but we had a lot of Aboriginal players playing. And I just picked them because they could play. So, whether it was Clem Michael or Winston Abraham or Scotty Chisholm or Dale Kickett, they were actually picked because they could play. And it just so happened that in the era we were in, very few clubs had Aboriginal players, and quite a few clubs didn't have any. And that's not a slight on them. We just did something that, for us in West Australia, it was pretty normal to have a few players playing for you in every team that were Aboriginal fellas, and they were just great blokes, good friends, successful men, picked because they can play. So we had a fair few of those. It was great that we maybe broke the mould of being fearful of having more than 1 or 2 or 3, because, would they go home? Would they stay in Melbourne? There's lots of question marks which were legitimate. And, of course, now they're a very prominent part of the whole system. If you want to win, you need these guys who have got that extra flair and can do things differently. And it just comes, they bring something unique. Well, I think you'd really want to copy GWS. And the reason I say that is they got flogged pretty badly in the early stages. Like, they were getting really hammered. And one thing I reckon Kevin Sheedy did was that he kept everyone in the club positive and just said, just wait, be patient, your time will come. The kids will grow up. They'll be 23, 24, somewhere down the track. And when they get there, and we can keep them all together and keep them happy, will be hard to beat. And I think Tony Shepherd, the coaches they've had, Kevin Sheedy, the guys who've managed that, I think they're an example of best practice. Remembering these days, you don't go to South Australia and pick up Kernahan or Bradley. You don't come to West Australia and pick up, a 100-game player in Morris Rioli or Graham Moss or Ross Glendinning. That era is gone. Everyone's picking 17-year-olds. There's no mature age players in the system anymore. I think it's a failure of the system, but that's the system. So you're going to pick a lot of young players to be in your squad. You're going to hope to get a few older players to give them some cover physically. And then you need to keep your players together if you want them to be successful down the track. And as I said, GWS are a good example, but it's pretty hard when you've got marauding clubs from over the ditch in Victoria who, because a lot of the boys will be Victorian. So it's challenged, which is not mine.
Ever since the AFL announced that they'd awarded Fremantle a licence on December 14, 1993, the Dockers have beaten to their own drum. From their colours and their song, through to the game styles implemented and characters on and off the field, Fremantle has had to find a way to differentiate themselves in a state dominated by an AFL powerhouse, and for the most part, they've succeeded. The initial list concessions certainly didn't help their cause when it came to on-field success, a point of contention that still burns beneath the surface some 20 years later. While their trophy cabinet remains barren, the Purple Haze have developed their own unique culture and have added plenty of colour, excitement and flavour to the AFL landscape.
Next to put him off. In comes Longmuir to take his kick. Ice cool. Fremantle have won after the siren. Look at that. Look at the scenes here at Fremantle. The Dockers, shockers on Friday Night Football, become last-second heroes.
Thanks for listening to AFL Team Builders, a zerohanger.com production. In next week's episode, we examine the Port Adelaide Power, which entered the competition after dominating the South Australian National Football League for 126 years. They quickly realised, however, that they were no longer a big fish in a small pond upon their entry in 1997, quite the opposite.
We actually got fined by the AFL for breach, and we paid a $50,000 fee. And that $50,000 fee was probably, in hindsight, the best thing we invested.